Hey there, this is Codefinity, and in this video, we're going to talk about how we fetch data to bring it into our applications. And to do that, we're fortunate enough to have this dummy JSON uh, system, or whatever we want to call it, which just gives us a bunch of free sample data that we can use to play around with stuff. So you can see here that I've actually just gone into my browser and put this URL in here that ends with /products, and I get back just raw product data. So that's pretty cool, and that's the essence of how the web works. We use JSON, or JavaScript object notation, to create this portable data format that really any modern language can consume and do something with. JSON, again, JavaScript object notation, and it's just a way to put data together just with regular text that looks like a JavaScript array of objects. And you can imagine that if we were able to get this data into our web application, we would be able to map over this array and transform each one of these objects into, a list item, a card, whatever it is, you name it, okay? And this is really the bridge between front end engineering, where we're in the browser and we're building, cool looking stuff, as opposed to back end engineering, where we're working with raw data. So before any of this can work, a back-end engineer would have to configure a database and set up all these fields, and then set up a server that will receive a request, for instance, that ends with /products. And because it ends in /products, that server knows, oh, hey, I need to go to the database and grab all these products and put it together into this JSON format and send it back out to the requester or the client. So we can do this clearly in the browser, because that's what a browser does, right? You put in a URL and it'll render rather a complete web page, or it'll just render raw data depending on what the server sends back. But how do we actually work with this in our code? To do that, we're going to play around a little bit using this little template repo. If you want to follow along, there's a link to this in the description. You can look at the README, but you clone this, you make sure you have bun installed, or maybe you're using just regular npm, whatever it is, and you want to run bun install, and you're ready to go. So again, you clone this, you can run bun I or bun install, and start using it. So the way this works is we have this JavaScript file here. Right now it just has this simple console log. We can run this file with bun or node or whatever, and it'll just run the code. So that's the setup here. So how do we actually fetch data? So what we're going to do is we're going to say fetch. We'll start with just console.log fetch. Oops, fetch. We'll spell fetch correctly. And then we'll just grab this same URL here, and we'll pop this in here, and that's it. So we're just going to run the fetch and log the data, and it's magically going to show us the same data, right? No, maybe not. Instead, we get this thing back called a promise. So promises are a pretty deep topic, but all we need to know for the purposes here is that a promise, you can think of it as something like a buzzer at a restaurant. If you go to a busy restaurant and make a request for a table, you walk into the front, whatever, the host or hostess says, oh, we're full, but here you go. Here's this red buzzer. You take this and go have a seat at the bar. And when it goes off, you come back and see me. That buzzer is essentially a response. So we have made an external request to some other server somewhere. JavaScript has nothing to do with this part of it. It's just saying, okay, well, I'm just going to send this request off, and there should be something coming back at some point. Kind of like, here's a buzzer, and at some point it's going to buzz. But clearly, we need something more than this. This is nothing. The promise, the pending promise, is just like a restaurant buzzer that's pending. That's going to be going off, presumably. What happens in that restaurant scenario is you get your buzzer. When it's going off, then you want to, follow up. You want to go back to the hostess, turn your buzzer in, go get your table, etc., etc. So we need to continue this process. and tell JavaScript what we want to happen once this whole business is resolved with the promise. So what we're going to say is then, and for right now, we're going to just use a callback in here and say console.log response. Okay? So all we're saying here is, hey, I want to fire off this request. It may take a second, it may take 10 seconds, the server might be down, I don't know. But assuming that it goes through, then I want that raw data response, and this is just a made up name. It can be, whatever, and you would say console.log whatever. This is nothing but a callback function. So we're saying make this fetch, then run this function. Call this function back, callback function. All right, so now let's see if this gets us any closer. And it does. We get back this raw response, and it tells us that it went through, and there's a whole bunch of data in here, but it's not really what we actually want to see. It's not the raw data, and that's because this is like going into a program and doing like file open, and you're making an attempt to read the file. Right now, we're making an attempt to read this data, but there is another step to this. First, we have our buzzer, and now we're walking up to the front to give our buzzer, to the hostess. And now, then we want to actually go and get our table. So then we'll take this data and we will, actually in here, rather than console log, we don't want to log this. We want to take this data and we want to read it as JSON. Escape here. Okay, so let's step through this. Fetch the data. All right, here's your buzzer. Oh, when the buzzer goes off, go up and talk to the hostess, turn your buzzer in, and now go to your table. So in other words, take this raw data response and read it as JSON. Now that that has been resolved and read as JSON, now we actually get to go to the table or look at the data. All right, so we'll run this again. And this time we actually get everything here. So that's why you'll see this, in this simple example, that's what they're doing here. You fetch it, then you take that raw response and you open up the file and read this as JSON. So it's actually two asynchronous processes happening, because what if the data is corrupted? What if the JSON is invalid or something? Then we just have corrupted data and it's going to crash out. We're not actually going to get to see anything. But ultimately, that's what it's all about. You fetch the data using an asynchronous promise object, use the then keyword to take that data and then read it. Almost always you want to read it as JSON, and then you want to do something with it like log it. To kind of just wrap this up, instead of just logging the data, from here you have that data, which we just saw here, right? We'll just run this again. We have this. So this is what we mean. We can say, okay, now we can go through here and we can do something else with this data. For instance, if we just want to look at the titles, we can do that. We could say, hey, I don't want to see all this data. I know there's some titles in here. So now I'm going to look at each product. So I'm going to go into data.products for each product. And instead, I'm just going to say console.log product.title, if I did that correctly. All right. Let's see here. Okay, title. So you can see from here, if we were in a browser environment, we can start to do things. You can start filtering, mapping, all that good array, all that array methodology really comes into play. And that's essentially what a lot of front-end engineering is. It's making a fetch for some raw data and then doing stuff with that data to put it in the browser. So this is just a really brief, high-level introduction to promises, fetching data asynchronously, and using the then keyword. Now, quite frankly, kind of messy. So before we wrap this up, I'm going to show you a more modern approach to do the same thing. We're going to say data equals await, And we'll do, not that. Why is it I? Make me type this in here again. Okay, so we're going to say this. Let's do this a little bit cleaner. And this is really the most modern way to do it. If we just now log this data, we can see the raw response. And this is so much cleaner. So use this keyword await and use await whenever you know it's something asynchronous. So this is much cleaner than the then and the callbacks. So if you put an await in here and then similarly, you can say products, there you go. I want to fetch that data and await the results of that so I can get the raw response. And then I want to read that data asynchronously and await the result of that promise so I can get that there. And now you can log products. And that is so much cleaner, isn't it, than all the then stuff? But it's important to know both ways. I would say 98% of the time you're going to want to write it this way, but you still want to be aware of the then syntax. All right, this is more than enough for right now. Let me know if you have any additional questions or some follow-up, and we'll go from there.